Hallo und willkommen bei halb10.fm, dein Podcast für eine neue linke Politik. Ich bin Tamara, hier mit Franzi und heute reden wir mit Quinn Slobodian über sein Buch Globalisten, das Ende der Imperien und die Geburt des Neoliberalismus. Quinn ist ein Historiker auf Wellesley College in Massachusetts und ist spezialisiert auf die moderne deutsche Wirtschaftsgeschichte. Hallo Quinn, hallo Franzi.
Hallo.
Hi.
Heute wollen wir diskutieren, eigentlich, was ist der Status quo von Neoliberalismus? Was ist Neoliberalismus? Was ist Ordoglobalismus? Und wie geht es dem Neoliberalismus gerade in der Corona-Zeit, in der Pandemie? Ich habe von unserem Producer Flo, also von unserem Produzenten gehört, dass wir mindestens einmal im Jahr einen Podcast auf Englisch machen dürfen. Und das werden wir auch heute tun. Also diese Folge wird auf Englisch gehalten werden. Also wechsle ich kurz auf Englisch. So Quinn, I was thinking we'd start this way. How to characterize your story about the birth of neoliberalism. In the book, Globalists, in English, The End of Empire and the Birth of Neoliberalism, you characterize a multi-generational genesis of thought, something that's almost picaresque, seen from the world, seen from the point of view of one might say, if one is on the left, villains of the 20th century, people like Ludwig von Mies, people like Friedrich Hayek. And I'm talking, of course, of these progenitors of the Austrian school. The story that you tell, it begins in Vienna in the 1920s with the Mies Circle and the Stubenring, not far from where I live, and it ends with the World Trade Center. So you really shift the geographic emphasis away from North America, from the Chicago school, and you put it in Europe. And not only in Austria, but also in Germany with Ordo Globalism or the Ordo liberals, and then finally the Geneva School liberals. So can you tell us more a little bit about this origin story? Why should we blame German speakers for neoliberalism?
Well, I guess the thing that I was trying to take on was what I thought was a kind of common story about the history of neoliberalism, which I thought was also kind of misleading. And the story that I think people know best, if they've thought about this concept at all, is the kind of version of it that's told probably most famously by David Harvey in his book, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, which has on its cover sort of iconically Margaret Thatcher, Augusto Pinochet, Ronald Reagan, and Deng Xiaoping, right? All people who were in power in the late 1970s, 1980s, who, by the account of Harvey, kind of rolled out a new version of what he calls market fundamentalism, rolled back social democracy, rolled back the welfare state, rolled back workers' rights, and rolled out a world of high finance, precarious working conditions, ever more militarized forms of cross-border intervention, and ever less social security. And I think that story sort of proceeds from a local scale, especially a national scale, where you see the first sort of laboratories of neoliberalism, especially Pinochet's Chile after the violent overthrow of Allende in the 70s, and then in the United States of Reagan, then in the Britain of Margaret Thatcher. And only after these kind of national experiments is it then kind of scaled up and globalized through the Washington Consensus, which takes over in the 1990s. So you think about then structural adjustment programs, the role of the IMF in kind of dictating to poorer nations that they have to restructure their internal economies. And then the World Trade Organization, as you mentioned, created in 1995 as the kind of crown jewel of this new form of neoliberal globalism. So that story is like quite heavy towards the end of the 20th century, and it basically goes from nation to global, like 70s, 80s to 90s. And my feeling that led me to write the book was that this didn't really capture the kind of urgency that neoliberals felt about global capitalism, nor did it sort of capture accurately the narrative by which we got to where we did get to by the end of the 1990s. And that, in fact, the problem of neoliberalism was always a global problem. The neoliberals always believed that there was a need to somehow secure and knit back together a global economy. An early version of the book was titled "The World Economy Must Be Defended," sort of riffing on Foucault, because I think that neoliberals actually were working with this global sensibility, not starting in the 1990s. In fact, as I write about in the book, starting more like 1919. And why then? Because the First World War really exploded what they saw in retrospect as the kind of golden age of global laissez-faire capitalism in the late 19th century, when you had a gold standard that wasn't governed by anyone in particular. You had a huge amount of cross-border financial flows, people investing their money, from Frankfurt to a copper mine in Chile and having it insured in London, and not having to worry about the expropriation because the gunships were always there, not having to worry about the loss of the value because the gold standard kept the value of money stable. So this is the best way, I think, to think about what is neoliberalism. Well, it's a desire to go back to this era of the late 19th century, the so-called first age of globalization, which, as we all know, included a huge amount of labor exploitation, hyper extractive processes all over the world, no protection of basic labor rights, no protection of basic social rights. So looked at from the point of view of most people, this was hardly a time you'd want to return to. Looked at from the point of the neoliberals, it was a time where, yes, there may have been inequalities and injustices, but there was so much new value being created. There were so many more of the world's resources being accessed like never before. And there was so much of a complete international division of labor that you needed to somehow chart a map back to that. The First World War blew that up because it was a terrible war between empires, on the one hand. People who were supposed to be working on the principle of you trade together, you never go to war together. That ended up not being true at all. And worse than that, after the First World War, this principle of national self-determination, promulgated by Woodrow Wilson, made part of the kind of the vision of the League of Nations, the breakup of the territorial empires like the Habsburg Empire, the Ottoman Empire, made normal or kind of mainstream this idea that every people should have their own language in their own territory. And by extension, they started to think their own industry, their own manufacturing base, their own working class. So this supposedly wonderful unity of the world economy was being broken up into many small mosaic pieces of political national economies, which was the problem then for the neoliberals starting in the 1920s, is how do you make people subordinate political desires of national self-determination and prioritize visions of global economic interdependence. So that, putting the world back together again is not something that just started in the 90s. It was something that started after the rupture of the First World War. So my story had to kind of begin there and then follow the kind of the stations by which sort of inadequate forms of globalism were realized from the 1920s into the 1990s.
Before we dive into all the decades between the 1920s and now, let's get to now. Since the outbreak of the pandemic and then the first lockdown during the COVID-19 pandemic, there has been this, you call it rumor in your article in The Nation, that neoliberalism is dead now. And you also say that this hasn't been the first time people say that, and not the first time this rumor has been around. So is neoliberalism dead now? Is it coming to an end? Is it nearly dead? What is happening right now? Because it feels like capitalism is having a comeback right now, whilst everything else hasn't had this comeback, or sort of comeback.
Yeah, well, I think it really depends on how we define neoliberalism, right? So I think it's always best to start these conversations by pointing out that I think there's at least three main ways that the term gets used. One is to just refer to a kind of a period of time, like to use the kind of Harvey understanding, like from about the late 1970s up to the present ? Right? So this is the meaning by which people would say, is neoliberalism over? Is it dead? Do we need to have a new name for this era of global capitalism we're entering into? So that's just a kind of what historians would call like a periodization, like an era. Another way to define neoliberalism is a kind of policy package, right? It's like a bundle of things that states do: privatization, deregulation, union breaking, and so on. And so then you can say, oh, this country is like a little bit neoliberal because they're doing things X, Y, and Z, but they're not doing things A, B, and C. So you can sort of have levels of neoliberalism, right? And that's kind of the way I would say people are looking at the Biden administration, for example. They're sort of saying, okay, what's neoliberal that he's doing and what isn't? Well, he doesn't seem to have a very neoliberal attitude towards debt or spending. They're spending like crazy. Doesn't seem to have a very neoliberal attitude towards trade. They're keeping all of these Trump tariffs and defending American manufacturing in a way that isn't very globalization friendly. But on the other hand, so far, the kind of huge amount of money that's being created is still going to a very small number of extremely wealthy people. And the working conditions for average people are not really changing. They're still, hyper surveilled. They're still working multiple jobs just to be able to pay for their rent and for their kids' food and so on. So in that sense, you could say, is it neoliberal still? Well, depends on what you look at. A bit of it still is, a bit of it isn't, right? The third way, though, people define neoliberal is the kind of the way I use it in the book, which is to describe a kind of intellectual movement, basically, that a group of people got together in the 1930s and said, socialism is bad, we think, but full-on laissez-faire liberalism is also not working. We need to rethink the role of the state to protect the market in an era of nationalism and mass democracy. So how can we rethink the role of government when political forces might be pushing against things like capital rights, private property rights, and so on, right? And so they started these conversations in the 1930s with not so much success over the decades, as I talked about, with kind of breakthroughs in the 1980s and 90s. So in that sense, if you were to say, is neoliberalism dead? The question would be, are there still people from this intellectual tradition having conversations? Yes, there are. They haven't all suddenly vanished from the face of the earth. Then it's worth saying, well, what do their conversations look like? Let's look more closely, right? And there I think that you find interesting things. You find out that some of those same people, those kind of free market intellectuals, who in the 1980s might have said the European Union is great because it's locking in free trade, it's locking in liberalization of capital movements. By the 1990s and the 2000s, they're starting to say the European Union is actually a socialist Trojan horse that's bringing in climate policy, it's bringing in all kinds of transfers to the poorer nations of the union and so on. So those neoliberals, not the neoliberal era, not neoliberal policies, but neoliberals, have shifted their strategy. So instead of talking about globalism, actually they're talking about nationalism, right? So this is where you get this curious situation, which I don't know if you plan to bring up, but we might as well bring up. But Hans-Georg Maaßen, the conservative CDU politician, who was trying to join the Hayek Society, which is the most literal group of neoliberals you could possibly imagine, is nonetheless criticizing Globalisten, among other things, recommending my book, which is confusing if you don't follow these mutations in neoliberal thought, right? It would be like, but if globalism is neoliberal, how can this guy who wants to be in the Hayek Society be criticizing globalists? This is where you need history. You need to know that in the early 2000s, some of those people who had believed in global solutions for capitalism's problems started to become disenchanted with global solutions and, more importantly, worried that things like the WTO would be taken over by climate activists, would be taken over by progressive politicians, and turned into a kind of green globalism, climate globalism. This is their worst nightmare, actually. So they said, no more globalism. In fact, no more Europeanism. Let's go back to the nation. Hence the founding of the IFD in 2013 by ordoliberal economists who wanted to go back to the Deutschmark, not interested in the European Central Bank. And then someone like Maaßen is clearly in that tradition now of kind of anti-globalist, nationalist neoliberals, which is not a contradiction at all. It's actually can be, explained pretty clearly. But the point being that what neoliberalism is changes from decade to decade, and it kind of needs to be historicized if you want to think of it as a kind of a coherent intellectual movement. What neoliberals wanted in 1950 is not what they want in 2020. They see the world differently as the world changes. So I think that, I think it's helpful to think about those three different ways of conceiving of neoliberalism: intellectual tradition, a bundle of policy ideas, and then a kind of a grand sweep of global history.
In the book, I mean, one of the major tensions, or one of the major, very rich parts of the book, is how you chart this tension between the nation, nationalism, and sovereignty, and the globe, the global order, ordo globalism, and the utopias sketched out by people like Mies and Hayek. And you chart out how they're from the 1920s, from 1919, as you say, when your story begins, until the 1980s, how those conceptions of the globe and global order changed. Can you just briefly describe some of the really, briefly describe sort of that transformation, and also just what does internationalism mean to these people? Why did you name your book Globalists? What does the globe mean? What is ordo globalism? This has a very rich tradition. You mentioned in the book it comes from medieval theology, the idea of the order. And it's something that comes across very almost beautifully in your exegesis of Hayek, this idea that Hayek saw the world in these natural metaphors, schools of fish, things that were constantly in flux and changing, and asked his readers and asked his followers to look beyond, price forecasting and mathematics to something bigger. Like, what does the globe mean for these people? And in a way, does it mean, if their notion of the globe was always changing, is it also true that the nation has changed with it? Because, as you just said, you have these ordo globalists becoming nationalists. Well, does that mean that the nation is no longer tied so much to self-determination, to the principle of sovereignty, to democracy?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think one way into that set of questions is to say that the idea of the world economy and how you can conceive of it and how you can see the world economy actually has its own history too, and it's not necessarily that long of a history. So I've written about this in German. The term Die Weltwirtschaft only enters the language in the 1880s, basically. In English, you only start talking about the world economy in about the 1920s, actually. So it was sort of less than 100 years ago. And as the economy and the world economy became to be seen as something that you could track through statistics, that you could maybe model through econometrics, you could map out through cartography, then people started to think of it as something that you could actually plan and organize and rearrange. You could sort of, balance it out. You could do redistribution. You could think about sending capital to some parts of the world and not to others, right? And this is kind of the whole project of international development in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s is about people looking at the world economy and trying to figure out how you might be able to make a more equal world, a world that has less inherent inequality and so on. Well, the neoliberals were actually deeply skeptical from the 1930s onward of this project of making the economy visible and making the economy something that can be seen in statistics, organized in plans, overseen through forms of transfers or the movement of capital and investment. Why? Because they saw this project of national income accounting and econometrics and so on as basically a socialist project. They instead adhered to basically, as you said, Tamara, a kind of a religious idea of what the economy is. I describe it as the sublime world economy in the book as an attempt to get to the kind of reverence that people like Hayek had for the economy, which they wouldn't even call the economy. Hayek had his own word for it. He called it the catalaxy. He used this Greek word, which is talking about, exchange creating harmony. And as you say, for him, this sphere of human activity was something that was not just like mechanistic or something that you could actually capture in a mathematical formula or put on a computer, but it was something that was kind of like the neurons in the mind or the stars in the galaxy. It was a complex system that had a kind of internal rationality and order of its own. Therefore, the goal of neoliberalism as a kind of proactive intervention was not so much about economics. It wasn't actually about changing the economy. It was about creating a form of state and legal framework within which this kind of invisible, sublime world economy could operate. The term that I use in the book is encasement, which was translated as Ummantelung in the German version. So rather than markets being kind of liberated or set free, which is often how it's described in the 1990s and so on, I think it's much better to think about this period that we call neoliberalism as a period of encasement. We've had many, many more laws, many, many more treaties, many, many more forms of protecting assets, ensuring their separation from forms of taxation and so on. It's a period of legalization, not a period of liberation of markets. So if you think about the proactive project of neoliberalism as one of legal encasement and legalization, then it's obvious that has to happen at different scales, right? It doesn't just happen at the global level. In fact, one of the things about the European Union that the neoliberals really loved was that it had kind of cracked this puzzle of what they call multi-level governance. So if you're a member state in the European Union, you're subject to the judgments of the European Court of Justice. The European Court of Justice can actually enter the national sovereign space and compel national governments to do things, even if their own electorates say they don't want to do them, right? And as a member of a member state, someone is a citizen of Germany or so on, or Austria or whatever, you can also bring cases up to the European Court of Justice as an individual. So there's this possibility of what's called direct effectiveness in legal theory. And the neoliberal sort of approach to securing economic freedom has always tinkered at these different levels. So for the AfD order liberals to be interested in the nation now, that doesn't mean that they want to then forget the rest of the world. No, obviously not. You look at the program for the AfD, the early years, they still want free trade. They even want settlement through the WTO. They're actually totally fine with forms of multi-level governance. They just want to take certain competencies out of the hands of Brussels, things like, of course, asylum policy and decisions on environmental protections and things like that. So I think that this is also, for me, a clarifying way to think about what is neoliberalism, because it can feel so nebulous and sort of vague. Just think of it as a project of state building and a project of legal design. And then you just think about, okay, what kind of laws are being passed at the national level, at the international level, at the European-wide level? How do those work for or against a kind of a vision of economic freedom as defined by neoliberals in terms of sound money, keeping distribution away from democratically elected governments? So it's a way of thinking about a space that is not internationalist, right? This is to answer your question, because that implies, a relationship between nations. They were thinking about a kind of a world that exists parallel to, but not identical with, the world of nations. That is the world of the world economy, which is a global space, which ideally for them would be protected in its activity by nations against other nations. So the role of national law is to sort of make sure that property rights are global, capital security is global, the right to move money over borders is global. These are all things that nations are the only ones who can do, but they're sort of protecting a sphere, which, I follow Roman law and Carl Schmitt and the order liberals to call the space of dominium, or the space of property, against the space of imperium, or the space of sovereignty and states. So hence globalists, is that their focus is on this sort of the half of the world, of the doubled world, that is associated with property and ownership and economics. And that undertaking is one that happens through states, but is not primarily about states.
You were speaking of like the state building neoliberals were working towards. because they needed strong institutions. They were not against institutions in general. They needed strong institutions to actually defend the freedom of the global economy, meaning like freedom of free movement of capital, for example. Maybe you could, and you also mentioned the WTO as an important institution. Maybe you could, because in the book you mentioned a few of them, maybe you can dive a bit into like what are the most important institutions and what is their function in establishing this form of economy that we call neoliberal now. And if we talk about legal design as the other thing that needed to happen, in your book you refer to the intellectual property rights as an important thing to actually secure American hegemony in a way. And maybe you could describe this process, like the process of building these institutions and establishing those strong institutions who work, who transcend national borders, and also the process of legal design, securing, or firstly those institutions, and second the economic mechanisms they are working for.
I can use the example of the World Trade Organization first, which came into existence in 1995, but it was originally supposed to come into existence 50 years earlier in 1946, as there were meetings then, as I describe in the book, to create what was then called an international trade organization, which is interesting, right? International rather than world. An international trade organization. However, the meetings to create this ITO had representation from poorer parts of the world, specifically Latin American countries, who were game to discuss a form of global economic governance that would govern trade. And they thought that, among other things, what that should allow for is nations to be able to claim natural resources on their own territory as the property of the nation itself. So one of the main things that they wanted to be able to do was to expropriate foreign-owned property inside of their own borders. Because, of course, the whole history of extracting natural resources from poorer countries has been one led by foreign capital and primarily profiting foreign capital disproportionately. And so they're like, well, that's obviously unjust. And we're in an era now of national self-determination. We're also in an era of social democracy. The Labour government in the UK is nationalizing the mines, is nationalizing heavy industry. So why can't we in Mexico or Peru or Iran nationalize our oil fields, nationalize our copper fields, nationalize our bauxite mines? The poor nations, or the richer nations, as you can imagine, were not excited about this idea. And so they basically just scuppered the negotiations, and the ITO never came into existence. Instead, what we got was GATT, which was just a kind of a loose negotiating forum. It didn't have the form of the binding rule of law. So flash forward 50 years, what do we get? We get the WTO. Do we find any of the trace of those earlier demands for like national sovereignty over natural resources? Of course not. No, those have long been laundered out of the possibility of a form of global economic governance. What we get instead is a desire to make the right to trade into a human right. So this person who's sort of central in the last chapter of my book, Ernst Ulrich Petersmann, that's a German guy who studied with Hayek in Freiburg. He's like, this is so wonderful. We're creating the WTO as a kind of a scaled up version of the European Union, because in the European Union, if you want to, let's say, buy a product from a neighboring country, and it's more expensive because your own country subsidizes the production of that product, then you can go to Luxembourg, you can go to the European Court of Justice, and they might make your government stop subsidizing its own products or even sell off a state-owned industry, right? What we call competition law is the most important part of European integration for neoliberals. So Petersmann thought, this is wonderful, we're doing this now at the world level. Not the international level, but the world level. This is the space of dominion, which now they're governing, right? And so what came into existence at the WTO was just that. It was something that was primarily interested in the kind of inviolable right of free trade, the rights of investors for security over borders. So that's one example. Another example is the creation of investment law, which is something I write about quite a bit in the book. And that's this amazing thing where corporations can sue countries for lost profits. So the first one of these was created between West Germany and Pakistan under Earhart in the late 1950s. And now they're standard, and there's thousands and thousands of them. So it means when, say, you want to invest in Malaysia, you sign one of these bilateral investment treaties, which means that if a future Malaysian government decides to, expropriate the land on which your mine is being built, then the Malaysian government is forced to pay you back directly, right? So it limits the rights of sovereign nation states, and it gives more rights to private actors and private investors and private corporations. It puts corporations on par with nation states as just two forms of controlling the Earth's surface, right? So it doesn't allow for sort of political rights of self-determination to override the prerogative of economic freedom. So that's another example of something that I think you could see as as a kind of a globalist legal notion that has been then put into practice, but has been contested all the way through. So it's also true now that lots of countries are now rejecting these BITs. It's also true that the attempt to kind of enshrine the right to move money over borders as a human right hasn't exactly been realized across the world, right? I mean, the WTO, as I mentioned in the book, since the protests in Seattle in 1999, hasn't actually passed a successful negotiating round. So one of the other sort of innovations or like twists in my book, I guess, is that it's very much a history of failures, right? It's not about the victory march of neoliberalism. It's more about showing how at every step, when the neoliberals thought that they were winning, they were actually facing a serious opposition, often from the poor parts of the world, often from the working class in the northern parts of the world. And the history of the creation of neoliberal globalism, even up to the end of the 20th century, is still more one of half measures and failure than it is of a sort of pure, untarnished victory.
Actually, that ties into something I wanted to ask you. I really had the impression while I was reading your book that these figures, people like Mies, were much more perturbed by, let's say, our side, or at least my side, socialism, social democrats, than we might think. I mean, you describe in 1927 for the Justizpalastbrand in Vienna how happy and relieved he was that the police struck back at the strikers. You describe at the end of the book how shaken these neoliberals are by the protests in 1999 in Seattle. And this kind of makes me think that it's possible that leftists underestimate their own power when it comes to their opponents, but that the bugbears that you describe in this book are nations, national sovereignty, democracy, but obviously also socialism and the fear that somebody's going to strike back and expropriate a company that owns a mine somewhere or something like that. So there's this like very strong feeling that you get in the book of this kind of, like you said, it's a history of failures, but it's also a history of angst and anxiety about what the people can take back.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, if the talk was being given by someone who was a card-carrying member of the neoliberal crew, then they would tell this whole history differently, right? I mean, they would say that neoliberalism has always been about guarding against forms of collectivism on both the left and the right. So it was born in the twin fight against fascism and communism, and remains supposedly equally on guard against right-wing forms of populism and left-wing forms of populism, to use the terms that they would use in the last decade or so. But this is really a distorted history, right? Since the 1920s, the primary enemy has been the left. The primary enemy has been the socialist left. And in some kind of ironic ways, it's been less the far left and often more the near left. So what I mean by that is this. In the period of the Cold War, one would think that the neoliberals would be mostly concerned about the Soviet Union and then the People's Republic of China and other forms of sort of outright self-declared communism globally. But they weren't, actually. That wasn't their primary concern. Their primary concern was social democracy. Their primary concern was the fact that they thought that socialism was kind of creeping in, cloaking itself in a language of welfareism, in a language of cooperation between workers and capital, in a language of social justice above all. I mean, the weasel word, as Hayek called it, that troubled him most was the word of social justice. Milton Friedman said at some point that all of the horrors of the 20th century had come about because of the attempts to achieve social justice. And when he said that, he wasn't really thinking about Stalinism as much as he was thinking about the civil rights movement or LBJ's Great Society program or the expansion of European Nordic-style social democracy in the 1960s and 1970s. So that provides a really helpful, actually, perspective, I think, for people who are on the left, because I think it's very helpful to know what scares your enemies. And for me, it's been very illuminating to read, especially things from the late 80s and early 90s, to see how quick on the draw they were to be afraid of what we would now call the climate justice movement, what they would call then, the green movement, not in the sense of the Green Party, but in the sense of kind of grassroots environmental social movements. Literally from the moment the Berlin Wall falls, I have op-eds from the week after the Berlin Wall falls that say that the new socialism won't be red, it will be green. So they were very worried. The main reason they turned against the European Union in the 1990s was they thought it was turning green. So whether or not they were correct, it's illuminating to know that they were that concerned, right? They were thinking about the profit margins of some of their most important benefactors that often came from the world of petroleum and fossil capital, that often came from the world of pharmaceuticals as well. Francie's question, which I didn't have a chance to answer, but intellectual property rights in the 1990s was a lot about defending profits of pharmaceutical companies, often at the expense, of course, of the suffering of people who couldn't have access to those pharmaceuticals. So looking at this from the point of view of who their enemies were over the decades, I think can be not only kind of empirically interesting or interesting as a kind of a narrative of back and forth, attack and counterattack, but also it can be sort of a good diagnosis for our current struggles to know what is the thing that sets them most on edge, that they have their snap meetings about, that they sort of get all uptight about. And yeah, it is climate and green stuff. It is the concern that redistribution is going to be scaled up. I mean, they're really worried right now that, things like the Green New Deal and the European Green Deal will mean that supranational organizations will take on this new role. Central banks, they used to trust them. Now they really don't trust them, right? They think that central banks have just abandoned all discipline and have just turned on the faucets of money creation and liquidity. And the fear is now for neoliberals, if people don't have a built-in fear of inflation, if they think that you can have really expansive social spending and you don't get inflation, then my God, what will they think of spending money on, right? I mean, that's a genuine anxiety for them. And so I think, thinking about it as a kind of a history of neoliberal angst is as useful as any other way of framing it, for sure.
I think we're going to do a short commercial break and I'll switch to German for that. Also wir haben jetzt gerade viel über die Feinde sozusagen gesprochen und über die Ängste auch der Feinde, also wovor Neoliberale Angst haben. So, und es gilt für uns Linke natürlich auch, Neoliberalen einfach auch weiter Angst zu machen. Und das heißt zum Beispiel, den großen Medienkonzernen was entgegenzuhalten und diesen ganzen Narrativen von oh mein Gott, Inflation, oh mein Gott, Klimakrise, das ist doch alles eine Lüge oder Ähnlichem, einfach was entgegenzuhalten und zwar am besten aus einer sozialistischen Perspektive. Und wenn ihr das tun wollt, dann solltet ihr unbedingt das Jacobin-Magazin abonnieren. Man munkelt, es gibt bald ein nächstes gedrucktes Magazin auch und ihr habt die fantastische Chance, falls ihr es noch nicht getan habt, diesen Podcast zu unterstützen und gleichzeitig Jacobin zu abonnieren. Ihr könnt ein Jahresprint-Abo abonnieren unter www.halb10.fm/Jacobin. Ihr kriegt einen Rabatt und ihr unterstützt halb 10 damit. Und das ist eigentlich der beste Deal, den ihr machen könnt. Die Stärke von linken Bewegungen und SozialistInnen kann ja sein, alle Bewegungen zusammenzubringen. Und unsere Stärke ist, Unterstützung für halb 10 Jacobin und Co. zusammenzubringen. Außerdem ein letztes Schmankerl. Dieser Artikel, den wir am Anfang erwähnt haben, in The Nation, der ist auf Deutsch übersetzt worden von Quinn und ist unter dem Titel, jetzt muss ich kurz nachschauen, die Aasgeier des Kapitals setzen darauf, dass wir nichts unternehmen, auch beim deutschen Jacobin erschienen, also da könnt ihr schon mal reinschnuppern. Genau, insofern www.halb10.fm/Jacobin und unterstützt sowohl Jacobin als auch uns. Super Sache, macht das mal. Okay, I'm gonna switch back to English. That's a bit challenging. It was interesting that you mentioned Hans-Georg Maaßen wanting to be part of the Hayek Foundation, because the Hayek Foundation is one of the most important think tanks who works against climate action and who's also connected with, for example, with the Friedrich Naumann Foundation, which is the foundation of the Liberal Party in Germany. So there's this huge network of anti-climate organizations who are quite neoliberal. And yeah, they're working against this, and they're so afraid of like collective action, because the only thing that helps against the climate crisis and like the ecological crises in general is collective action. And that's what they are afraid of. Speaking of what makes neoliberals being afraid of the left, there might be a chance to challenge neoliberal capitalism right now, right? Because we're coming out of a crisis, and the economy can be restructured, and we have a chance to like have a say in that. What kind of social and political interventions would be necessary to actually make that happen and to challenge capitalism, as like the rumor said in the beginning of the pandemic, to bring it to an end maybe, but to challenge it in the first place? What kind of interventions would be necessary, and what could the left do to work towards that successfully right now?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would answer the question a bit differently, looking at Germany and Europe and then at the United States. So for Germany, I think, the coming elections are obviously extremely important. And most important there is, I think, the question of whether the debt brake survives, right? The Schuldenbremse, whether or not this remains the kind of shared common sense of all the main parties. I've just written a review of a great book by a guy named Julian Germann, and he makes the argument there that the reason why all the mainstream German parties, including the SPD, support the kind of low inflation, low rates of public investment model that Germany undertakes is they are a big export economy. You are a big export economy, and need to keep wage levels low in order to basically use the EU as a kind of hinterland for cheap supply chains for higher end goods that can then be sold on increasingly to China, right? So Germany is not just making choices for Germany, it's also making choices effectively for the EU, because it's the kind of swing vote. If it chooses to go along with the kind of frugal state, so to speak, then there's no chance of a different kind of a policy towards the rest of the EU. If they were to change their position, then something new might happen. So I'm watching very closely the Green Party, not because I have a great personal faith in the Green Party. I think they have a great deal to be criticized for. But I think on this very specific point that they have in their Wahlprogramm, which is about replacing the debt brake, the Schuldenbremse, with a carbon brake, right? CO2-Bremse. If they're serious about that, if they're serious that the German state's attitude towards investment has to change fundamentally in response to the climate crisis, then this could really change the quality of the EU as a whole, right? I mean, it would immediately, of course, confront fierce resistance from many different angles, but I think this is the only kind of hope right now. This will then be accompanied by all the problems about, greenwashing and the false promises of green finance and carbon tax and these sort of fake market-based solutions. But still, this is the only chance, right? The only chance is that Germany changes its attitude towards public investment and public spending. So how that means one should vote in the fall, I'm not so sure. It depends, I think, how the polls transform in the coming months. But that's the thing I would say keep an eye on here in Germany. In the US, it's a kind of a different story, right? I think that in the US, you kind of have an opposite problem, which is at the top level, there are some extremely hyperactive, progressive policy thinkers who are whispering in Biden's ear as quickly as they can and trying to get as many things through this briefly democratically controlled government as they possibly can in the first 6 months, 8 months of Biden's presidency, right? So already we've had huge spending bills. We've had one on infrastructure, we've had one on jobs and the so-called family bill. Will these things survive in any kind of a credible form by the time they get through committee? Will the Democrats who are in the more swing states or the red states, like Joe Manchin from West Virginia, will they end up kind of poisoning the effort to do bold and radical policy changes? And then beyond that, once an election happens a year and a bit from now, will the Democratic majority be totally wiped out, thus putting the country back into the position of deadlock that it has spent much of the last decade and a half? In other words, the faulty machinery of democracy itself in the United States, the way that underpopulated states get way more influence than they should, the way that the suppression of the vote at the local level has become a total priority for Republican governors and Republican lawmakers, means that even if the ideas are there, if the problem in Germany is we're not sure if the idea is even there, the United States, the idea is there, but can the machinery of democracy actually match up to the idea? I'm not actually totally sure that it can, right? I think we can be optimistic and hope that it can. So I think there's that side of things, just can the Democratic will actually end up being expressed? But I think that the other thing I would mention is the question of work and organized labor in this country, in the United States. So right now, one of the most important things that's floating around Washington is the PRO Act, the Right to Organize Act. And the reason why I think that's so important is that I think that the people for whom the idea that neoliberalism is dead is most laughable is for the great majority of the population of this country who work at poverty or below poverty wage levels with no job security and no kinds of support from the state for the education of their children and the feeding of their families and so on. The workplace has not changed in the United States so far. It can only change through organized labor's actions. It can only change through organizing the workplace. And the question of whether this Democratic administration is going to help or hinder that, I think is one that I would also, if I'm watching the carbon break in Germany, I'm watching the support for organized labor from the White House in the United States. Because I think that it's very easy for me to envision an alternative future where the White House basically makes a truce with Silicon Valley. And the truce is we're going to fight China on these conditions. We're going to keep flexible workforce where you can hire and fire at will and make people work under atrocious Amazon warehouse type conditions. But the role of the government will be to put more of a floor under people with something like a universal basic income or kind of the basics of a welfare state. So you could have, something that is more welfarist, but no more favorable to the everyday lives of and the sense of autonomy of workers. And I think that truce between Silicon Valley and the White House needs to be resisted at all costs, right? The fact that we got out of the election with this horrible law that said that the Uber drivers in California are now workers, they're contractors, even as kind of apparently the Black Lives Matter movement like swept Biden to the White House, shows that this is still kind of a country divided, right? It's still anti-workerist, even if it is speaking a language of green climate justice and racial justice, which still remains to be actually realized.
I was going to ask you, your book ends with this prophetic line, the demos is not undone, in which I believe you're referring to the referendum and Brexit and just these pushbacks, at least when the time of the book was published in 2018, this rhetoric of a pushback to a neoliberal sort of rational order. And I was wondering, updated for 2021 and in our pandemic era, and touching on all the things that you just connected with each other, from issues of class to issues of climate change. I mean, can we characterize national referenda like these as real democracy? What is the real democratic machinery? How is, let's say, something like the PRO Act in the United States, something that can become an issue that mobilizes the electorate and not only labor groups and unions, because possibly it could just be that there is a sort of lack of coherence between these labor groups and between the electorate, something that works in the favor of neoliberals. But I mean, how do we, I guess, what is the future of democracy might be even a better question, since democracy is the thing that the neoliberals, at least from your account, are possibly the most scared of.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that if I had to say the biggest thing that has not necessarily come out of nowhere since the book was published, but has like further entrenched itself, is the kind of economic war with China. So I think that if anything has sort of broken globalism, it's the rise of China, which has now put the EU, Canada, the United States in a position of defensiveness and attempts to contain China through law, through new arrangements, and so on. So that's, I think, that's one of the ways in which the world that I was describing at the end of the 1990s is no longer the world we live in. The question of where a kind of democratic response will come from or what it will look like, I agree with you that a referendum is a kind of travesty in a way of a real practice of democracy. And I agree with you partially because of the way that I've seen referenda theorized by neoliberals themselves. So the most famous example here is the proposition from the late 1970s in California, which was known as a taxpayers' revolt, whereby the California state legislature was prevented from expanding state spending unless it had a supermajority. So you needed way more support than just 50% to be able to do things like spend more on schools and spend more on roads and infrastructure and so on. That was a great inspiration to neoliberals all the way up to the decision to leave the European Union in the UK, right? So when you offer people a yes/no question, it doesn't produce a sort of a rich democratic culture. It produces what we got there, which is a kind of a poisonous mixture of short-term kind of xenophobic and then financial motives on the part of the people who are funding it. So obviously, democracy needs to come from somewhere else other than the design of another yes/no referendum. And I think that the best model we've seen is the spontaneous emergence of social movements in the last year and a half in the United States, right? I mean, I feel like we should be talking every day about the fact that the United States saw some of the biggest street protests in its national history, like a few months ago, in the middle of an unprecedented global pandemic. It's not enough to kind of just sneer at the way that, for example, Black Lives Matter is being co-opted by corporate sponsors and companies. That is happening, yes. That's not worth our attention. We should pay attention to the ways that this has actually shone a light onto the ways that people's normal lives are informed and shot through with politics, even if they're not usually visible. And then the challenge is, how do you make that connection, right? I don't think it's immediately obvious how you connect, unite here organizing casino workers to the demand to defund the police, for example, in Minnesota, right? I mean, how do those things come together? I'm not exactly sure. It's a lot more clear to me that in Nevada, Bernie Sanders won the primary because of Latino service workers organized through a union supporting him and carrying that state in a way that no one expected it, right? So I think that there are those sort of conundrums, those places where you have to say, how do kind of slightly libertarian impulses of anti-police fit up with the more kind of let's build up a stronger workers representative inside of a social state? But then there's also, we shouldn't miss the sort of the ones in between. I mean, we shouldn't miss the fact that there has been a huge pace of reunionization in certain sectors, and we don't need to break our heads to just support those kind of activities that are sort of robust and kind of bursting forward, sometimes expected and sometimes unexpected. So I think, find the hard questions, but then also don't turn away from the kind of the easy ones, if that is not too pat of an answer.
Since we have to end on time today, I think that's also like sort of your closing sentence. I think that there is a possibility of change, and the social movements reflect on that a lot, maybe. And also, yeah, we have a war to win, and focusing on that, I think it's a good, a good perspective coming out of third lockdown. Maybe, nearing the end of the pandemic. How on what questions does the left need to focus to actually challenge neoliberal capitalism and to challenge this order that has been there over the last decades to make change and to create a better future for all?
Yeah, and I think, sorry if I'll just add one more thing there, especially I think relevant to the German context, probably Austrian and definitely Swiss, is I think it's also really important to avoid this overly easy binary between supposedly cultural politics and economic politics. There's nothing more mind-numbing to me than trying to read the German feuilleton these days, because all it is a kind of like an endless attack on some supposed idea of wokeness and political correctness gone mad. And all that is letting the right wing write the talking points for us. I mean, if you consider yourself on the left and you spend most of your time complaining about wokeness, I don't see how you can consider yourself on the left. I just don't. All you're doing is doing the work of the right for them. So I think that is it uncomfortable and difficult to understand how a demand made in the language of racial justice connects to something like workplace representation, especially if you're not from the United States and you're watching it from across the ocean? Yeah, it's difficult. Does that mean you should assume that the demand made in the language of race is somehow superficial and thin, and the only one that's real is the one that's made on the basis of class? Why would you do that? I just don't understand why you would sort of avoid the challenge of placing yourself into the skin and the experience of people who have had different lives than you. And that's, if there's anything I find most demoralizing now on the left, is like the failure of empathy, like the failure of an attempt to see the world through a perspective that is not one's own, right? Rather than that, there's so much just the quick and easy snap brush to judgment, instead of acting like a historian maybe a bit more and just saying like, well, what is the frame in which they operate? What do these words mean to them? What do these symbols mean to them? Why might they be something different than the way I see those symbols? I just think that kind of work of interpersonal kind of attempts, the leap of our subjectivity, is something that we could really do a lot more of.
I'd say we'd take this call for empathy as your closing sentence now.
Yes, thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. And I'm going to switch back to German right now to end this episode. also für alle, die unsere neue Folgenzählung noch nicht mitbekommen haben, heute war die Folge 99.4. Wir rasen förmlich auf die 100. Folge, unser großes Jubiläum hin. Aber wir hatten noch keine Idee dafür, wie wir das denn feiern können. Das heißt, wir mussten von 99 an in kleinen Schritten voranziehen. Wir sind jetzt bei 99.4. Wir sind dringend darauf angewiesen, dass Menschen uns Ideen für das Feiern unseres Jubiläums schicken. Insofern macht das gerne. Und ansonsten freuen wir uns, dass ihr wieder dabei wart heute. Ihr könnt, wenn ihr euch dieser Podcast gefällt und wenn ihr die Perspektiven, die hier vorkommen und so weiter, euren Freundinnen und Freunden zeigen wollt, was ihr dringend tun solltet, dann dürft ihr uns überall folgen, wo das möglich ist und es vor allem teilen. Sei das auf YouTube, sei das auf Twitch, sei das in der Podcast-App, die ihr üblicherweise nutzt, oder sei es auf Social-Media-Kanälen ansonsten. Und wenn ihr tatsächlich auch noch entweder Angst vor der Inflation habt und deswegen jetzt euer Geld nochmal schnell rumschieben müsst, oder wenn ihr eine Mark übrig habt, dann dürft ihr uns auch gerne spenden. Damit verbessert ihr die Qualität dieses Podcasts und könnt uns einfach ganz, ganz nett unterstützen, worüber wir uns immer sehr freuen. Das heißt, das könnt ihr tun unter www.halb10.fm/spenden. So, das war jetzt eine Reihe von To-Dos an alle, die diesen Podcast hören. Ansonsten würde ich sagen, sehen wir uns in der nächsten Woche wieder. Wichtig, 8:30 um 8:30. Die neue Uhrzeit ist immer noch, wir versuchen das zusammenzubringen, aber wir sind bei 8:30, also nächste Woche Mittwoch um 8:30 live oder anschließend bei euch in irgendeiner Podcast-App. Danke dir, Quinn, für deine Zeit. Es hat uns sehr gefreut, dass du da warst. Und uns bleibt nur zu verabschieden.
Okay.
Ciao.
Thanks for the chat. Bye.